My boss fired me in front of the entire office to humiliate me. 3 months later, he applied for a job at my new company. 3 months ago, I thought I had my career figured out. I was a senior project coordinator at a logistics company in Chicago. The pay wasn't amazing, but I'd spent 5 years there working my way up from an entry-level position. I knew the systems better than almost anyone. I trained new hires. I stayed late when projects were falling apart. And more importantly, I genuinely cared about the job. Unfortunately, my boss, Greg, cared more about looking powerful than actually managing people. The guy thrived on humiliation. If someone made a mistake, he'd call them out during meetings. If a project failed, he'd find someone else to blame. If a client complained, he'd throw an employee under the bus before investigating what happened. Everyone hated him. Nobody challenged him. Because Greg had one skill, making people afraid. For nearly 2 years, I kept my head down and avoided becoming his target. Then everything changed. One of our biggest clients was launching a major expansion project worth millions. The timeline was aggressive, but my team worked non-stop to make it happen. For weeks, I was pulling 12-hour days. Weekends disappeared. My girlfriend barely saw me. But we delivered everything exactly as requested. Or so I thought. 2 days before the launch, the client suddenly reported serious issues with inventory data. Greg immediately called an emergency meeting. The entire department was packed into the conference room. Around 30 people. Managers. Supervisors. Executives. Everyone. I assumed we'd discuss solutions. Instead, Greg walked in carrying a stack of printed reports and slammed them onto the table. Then he pointed directly at me. "Do you know how much this mistake is costing us?" The room went silent. I was confused. "What mistake?" His face twisted into a smile. The kind of smile people make when they're enjoying themselves. "The inventory failure." I knew immediately something wasn't right. Because I hadn't handled that data. Another department had. I tried explaining that. Greg cut me off. "No excuses." Then he started tearing into me. For 10 straight minutes. He questioned my competence. My work ethic. My intelligence. At one point he actually said, "This is what happens when people get comfortable and stop caring about quality." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. 5 years of loyalty. 5 years of excellent performance reviews. And suddenly I was being treated like I'd sabotaged the company. The worst part? Everyone knew he was wrong. I could see it on their faces. Several managers looked uncomfortable. A few co-workers wouldn't even make eye contact with me. But nobody spoke up. Nobody wanted to become the next target. Then Greg delivered the final blow. "In fact, I think we've tolerated this long enough." The room froze. Even the executives looked surprised. Greg turned toward HR. "I think it's time we part ways." My stomach dropped. I honestly thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. HR slid a folder across the table. My termination paperwork had already been prepared before the meeting even started. That was when I realized the entire thing had been planned. The accusations. The public humiliation. The fake investigation. Everything. They weren't trying to solve a problem. They wanted an example. And I was the example. I remember looking around the room. 30 people. Not one person said a word. Not because they agreed. Because they were scared. I signed the papers. Collected my laptop. And walked out of the office while everyone watched. 5 years ended in less than 20 minutes. When I got home, I felt completely broken. I kept replaying the meeting in my head. Maybe I should have argued more. Maybe I should have defended myself. Maybe I should have exposed the real department responsible. But none of it mattered anymore. I was unemployed. 3 weeks later, I learned something interesting. The inventory failure had nothing to do with me. Exactly what I'd said from the beginning. The company quietly admitted the error came from another division. No apology. No explanation. No attempt to fix what happened. Just silence. Then the calls started. Former co-workers began reaching out. One after another. And every conversation revealed a bigger disaster brewing inside the company. A disaster that Greg had absolutely no idea was about to destroy him. And 3 months later, I would be sitting on the other side of an interview table when his resume landed directly in front of me. After I was fired, I spent the first few weeks angry. Then angry turned into motivated. Instead of obsessing over what happened, I updated my resume and started applying everywhere. Within a month, I landed interviews with several companies. One stood out immediately. A rapidly growing logistics firm that had recently secured several major contracts. The culture was completely different from my old company. People actually listened to each other. Managers treated employees like adults. And during my final interview, something unexpected happened. The vice president asked why I had left my previous employer. I decided to tell the truth. Not the emotional version. Just the facts. I explained the inventory issue, the public meeting, and the termination. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he asked a simple question. Did anyone ever prove it was your fault? No. Interesting. 2 days later, they offered me the job. The salary was almost 40% higher than my previous position. Better benefits. More responsibility. And unlike my old company, they actually valued results. I accepted immediately. What I didn't know was that things were falling apart back at my former workplace. Several major employees had resigned after I left. The inventory problems continued. Clients started complaining. Deadlines were missed. And Greg, instead of fixing anything, kept blaming everyone else. Former co-workers kept me updated. Apparently morale was at an all-time low. Then came the call. About 3 months after I started my new position, our HR director forwarded me a resume. We're interviewing candidates for the operations manager role. Can you review this applicant? I opened the attachment. And nearly laughed out loud. Greg. My former boss. The same man who had publicly humiliated me. The same man who had proudly escorted me out of the building. The same man who thought my career was over. Now he was applying for a position at my new company. A position that would report directly to my department. The irony was almost too perfect. I didn't say anything immediately. I simply reviewed his application like everyone else. A few days later, he arrived for the interview. The hiring committee gathered in one of the conference rooms. Greg walked in confidently. Then he saw me. I've never seen someone's face change so fast. The color drained from it instantly. For a second, he looked genuinely shocked. Like he'd seen a ghost. I smiled politely. Good morning, Greg. The room was silent. Nobody else understood what was happening. Greg awkwardly sat down and tried to regain his composure. The interview began. At first, everything seemed normal. Then one of the directors asked him a question. Tell us about a difficult employee situation you've managed. I almost couldn't believe my luck. Greg launched into a story about leadership and accountability. He talked about maintaining standards. Taking responsibility. Treating employees fairly. Every sentence made the situation more ridiculous. Finally, another executive asked why he'd left. His previous company. Greg hesitated. Then he blamed restructuring. Bad market conditions. Corporate changes. Basically everything except the truth. That's when the HR director turned toward me. Since you work there too, does that align with your experience? The room went quiet. Greg looked absolutely terrified. I could have destroyed him. I could have told everyone exactly what happened. I could have repeated every humiliating word he'd thrown at me. But I didn't. Instead, I simply said, my experience was different. The director raised an eyebrow. How so? I looked directly at Greg. Then calmly explained the inventory incident. The investigation. The public termination. And the fact that the company later admitted I wasn't responsible. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't insult him. I didn't need to. The truth was enough. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody defended him. Nobody even looked surprised. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew exactly what kind of manager he was. The interview ended shortly afterward. Greg shook nobody's hand. He practically sprinted out of the building. The next morning, HR informed me that he would not be moving forward in the hiring process. A week later, I heard through former co-workers that he'd also been terminated from his old company. Turns out when you spend years blaming others for your mistakes, eventually there are no more people left to blame. The funniest part. The last time Greg saw me, I was carrying a cardboard box full of belongings after being fired. The next time he saw me, I was sitting on the hiring panel deciding whether he deserved a second chance. Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes. And honestly, watching him realize that was more satisfying than any revenge I could have planned. The best revenge isn't getting even. It's succeeding so much that the people who tried to destroy you end up asking for a seat at your table. I thought the story was over after Greg got rejected. It wasn't. About a month later, I received a message from a former coworker. Apparently, word had spread around my old company about what happened during Greg's interview. People couldn't stop talking about it. For years, Greg had built his reputation by making employees feel small. Now everyone knew he'd walked into an interview expecting to impress a hiring panel and instead found himself sitting across from the employee he'd publicly humiliated. But the biggest surprise came a few weeks later. One of the executives from my former company reached out to me directly. He apologized. Not one of those corporate non-apologies. A real one. He admitted they had handled my termination badly and said several people regretted staying silent during that meeting. It didn't change what happened. But hearing it felt surprisingly good. For years, I thought being fired in front of everyone was the worst day of my career. Turns out it was the best thing that ever happened to me. If Greg hadn't tried to humiliate me, I never would have left. I never would have found a better company. I never would have doubled my salary. And I never would have learned an important lesson. Sometimes the people who push you out of a door are actually pushing you towards something better. Last week, I got promoted. And as I sat in my new office, I couldn't help but laugh. 3 months earlier, Greg thought he'd ended my career. In reality, he had accidentally started it.